The winter of 1843 came to the Green River Valley like a judge delivering sentence. The first snow fell on October the 9th, 3 weeks earlier than any old-timer could recall, and it fell with a silence that made men uneasy. By the time November arrived, the passes were already choked with drifts taller than a man on horseback, and the temperature had dropped so low that spit would freeze before it hit the ground. The settlers who had staked their claims in this high valley, some 8 miles east of the Continental Divide, began to understand that they had miscalculated. This was not going to be a normal winter. This was going to be something else entirely. Silas Harrow stood in the doorway of his half-built cabin and watched the sky. He was a lean man, weather-beaten, with hands that bore the scars of saw teeth and axe glances. He had come west from Pennsylvania 3 years prior, following the promise of land and the dream of something better than the played-out farmland of his father's generation. He had built his homestead on a slight rise overlooking a creek that ran cold and clear even in August, and he had done it alone, felling each log, notching each corner, thinking each decision through with the methodical patience of a man who knows that mistakes in this country don't just cost money, they cost lives. But now, standing there with the wind cutting through his wool coat like it wasn't even there, Silas was thinking about roofs. Every cabin in the valley had been built the same way. You cut your logs, you notched them, you stacked them, and then you built your roof with a steep pitch, maybe 10, 12 degrees, sometimes more if you were cautious about snow load. The steeper the pitch, the thinking went, the faster the snow would slide off. Less weight on the rafters, less chance of collapse. It was common sense. It was what every carpenter from Boston to the Missouri had been doing for generations. The weight goes on, gravity pulls it down, the pitch sheds it away. Simple. Except Silas had been watching the other cabins. He had been watching them all through that brutal November, and what he saw troubled him. Old Man Garrett's place 2 miles down the valley had developed a sag in the ridgeline. You could see it from a distance, the way the roof line dipped in the middle, like the spine of an old horse. The Hutchins family, newcomers from Ohio who had arrived in late summer with a wagon full of furniture and optimism, had heard their roof beams groaning in the night, creaking sounds that woke the children and sent Mrs. Hutchins to prayer. And just last week, the supply shed at the McAllister claim had given way entirely, the roof collapsing inward with a sound like a thunderclap, crushing 3 months' worth of stored grain beneath a pile of broken timber and heavy, wet snow. The problem was becoming clear. The steep-pitched roofs were shedding snow, yes, but not fast enough, not consistently enough. Snow would accumulate in the valleys, in the angles where the roof met the wall, in any place where the wind formed an eddy. And that snow was heavy, heavier than most folks realized. A cubic foot of fresh powder weighed maybe 7 pounds, but once it settled, once it got wet from the freeze-thaw cycles, once it compacted under its own weight, that same cubic foot could weigh 30 pounds or more. You got 3 feet of that on a roof, and you were looking at nearly 100 pounds per square foot pressing down on timber that was already under stress from the wind and the temperature swings. The rafters would bow, the ridgepole would sag, and eventually, if the snow kept coming, the whole structure would fail. Silas had built his walls. He had cut and placed 22 courses of logs, each one fitted tight with moss and clay chinking. His walls were sound. But his roof was not yet finished, and that was by design, because Silas Harrow had been doing something that no one else in the valley understood. He had been thinking. Every night for the past month after the work was done and the fire was banked, Silas would sit at his makeshift table with a piece of charcoal and a smooth plank of pine, and he would draw. He would sketch roof designs, calculate angles, estimate loads. He had learned basic mathematics from a schoolmaster back in Pennsylvania, enough to figure board feet and rafter spans, and he was putting that knowledge to use now. The numbers didn't lie. A conventional roof, pitched steep to shed snow, created enormous lateral forces. The weight of the snow pressed down, yes, but the angle of the roof transformed some of that downward force into an outward force, a spreading force that pushed against the walls like hands trying to pry the cabin apart. The steeper the pitch, the greater that spreading force, and the more snow that accumulated, the more the walls were pushed outward. He had seen it happen. 2 winters ago, in a settlement further east, a church had been built with a fine, steep roof and proud white walls. The first heavy snow had pushed those walls out at the base, creating gaps you could slide a hand through, and by spring, the whole building was listing like a ship taking on water. They'd had to tear it down and start over, and the builder, a man named Coughlin, who'd come from Boston with credentials and confidence, had left town in disgrace. Silas didn't want to be Coughlin. More than that, he didn't want to be dead, or to have his family dead, crushed under a pile of timber and snow in the middle of February when the passes were closed and help was 100 miles away. So he kept drawing, kept calculating, kept thinking about forces and angles and the way things actually worked, not the way people said they worked. And that's when he saw it. The thing that would change everything, the thing that would make the other settlers call him a fool. The solution came to him not from a book or from another builder, but from observation. It was early December, and Silas had ridden up the valley to check his trap line. The snow was already deep, nearly 3 feet on the level, and the going was slow. His horse, a sturdy roan mare named Bess, plowed through the drifts with patient determination, her breath coming in great clouds of white steam. They had reached a place where the valley narrowed, and the creek ran through a small gorge, and Silas had stopped to let Bess drink and to eat a cold meal of cornbread and dried venison. That's when he noticed the lodges. There were beaver in this stretch of creek, and their lodges rose from the frozen water like small fortresses, dome-shaped mounds of mud and sticks and branches. The snow lay thick on them, accumulating in the bitter cold, but the lodges themselves showed no sign of collapse, no sagging, no failure. Silas dismounted and walked closer, studying them with the intensity of a man who understood he was looking at something important. The lodges weren't peaked, they weren't steep-roofed, they were domed. The shape was continuous, curving gently from the base to the top, with no angles, no valleys, no places for snow to accumulate unevenly. More than that, the curve meant that the weight of the snow was distributed evenly across the entire surface. Every point on that dome was supporting the load, not just a few rafters or a single ridgepole. The force went straight down into the structure, into the mass of the lodge itself, and from there into the frozen mud and ice of the creek. There was no lateral spreading force. There was no push against the walls. The dome was its own buttress, its own support. Silas stood there in the snow, feeling the cold bite at his cheeks, and thought about what he was seeing. Beavers had been building lodges for thousands of years, probably millions of years. They had survived ice ages and droughts and every kind of weather the mountains could throw at them. They hadn't read any books on carpentry. They hadn't consulted with master builders from Boston or Philadelphia. They had simply observed what worked, and they had done it. Could a man build a roof like that? Could a roof be shaped not like a triangle, but like a curve, not peaked, but domed? The more Silas thought about it, the more sense it made. A conventional roof was all about fighting the snow, about creating an angle steep enough to shed it away. But what if you didn't fight it? What if you accepted the snow, distributed its weight evenly, and let the shape of the roof itself do the work of supporting it? He rode back to his cabin as the winter sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. And he spent that entire night refining the idea. He would build a roof that was not flat, not steeply pitched, but curved. The center would be higher than the edges, but only slightly. Maybe a rise of 3 feet over a span of 20. That would give him drainage for rain and snowmelt, but the curve would distribute the weight of the snow load across the entire surface. Instead of a few rafters bearing the brunt, every piece of timber would share the load. Instead of lateral forces pushing the walls apart, the forces would go straight down, compressing the structure, making it stronger rather than weaker. There was just one problem. No one had ever built a roof like that. Not in this valley, not anywhere Silas had heard of. It would look strange. It would look wrong. It would look To use the word he knew was coming, upside down. Because instead of the roof rising to a peak and then sloping sharply down to the eaves, this roof would curve gently upward from the eaves and then curve back down again to a center that was barely higher than the edges. To someone expecting a conventional roof, it would look inverted, reversed, backwards. It would look like a fool's idea. But Silas Harrow had not survived 3 years on the frontier by being afraid of looking like a fool. He had survived by being right. He began work the next morning. The first step was to create a framework that would support the curve. In a conventional roof, you simply cut rafters to length, set them at the desired angle, and nailed them in place. But a curved roof required something different. Silas decided to use a technique he had read about in a book on shipbuilding. Of all things, he would create ribs, bent timbers that followed the curve he wanted, and then he would sheathe those ribs with planking. It was more work, more time, more complexity, but if it worked, it would be worth it. He started by steaming green wood, young spruce saplings that were flexible enough to bend without breaking. He built a long trough over his fire pit, filled it with water, and heated the saplings until they were pliable. Then, working quickly before they cooled, he bent them to the curve he had calculated and secured them in place with temporary bracing. It took him 3 days to create enough ribs to span his cabin, and by the time he was done, his back ached and his hands were blistered. But the framework was taking shape. The curve was gentle but distinct, rising from the log walls and arching gracefully to a center point that was only slightly elevated. It was on the 4th day that the visitors arrived. Silas was working on the crossbeams, securing the ribs in place, when he heard the sound of horses. He looked up to see 3 men riding into his clearing: Thomas McAllister, whose supply shed had collapsed the week before, Samuel Garrett, the old-timer whose ridgeline was sagging, and young Peter Hutchins, son of the family from Ohio. They had come, Silas knew, out of curiosity. Word traveled fast in a small valley, and the strange framework rising from Silas Harrow's cabin had not gone unnoticed. McAllister was the first to speak. He was a big man, red-faced and confident, the kind of man who believed that volume and certainty were the same as wisdom. "Harrow," he said, swinging down from his horse, "what in the name of all that's holy are you building there?" Silas climbed down from the roof and wiped his hands on his pants. "A roof, Tom. Same as you." "That's not a roof," McAllister said, walking closer. I don't even know what that is. Looks like you're building it upside down." Samuel Garrett, who was older and generally more cautious with his words, studied the structure with narrowed eyes. "It's curved," he said slowly. "You're curving the roof?" "That's right," Silas said. "Curving it gentle, so the snow load distributes even." "Snow don't load even," McAllister said flatly. "Snow piles up. That's why you pitch a roof steep so it slides off. You curve it like that. You're just making a bowl to catch snow. You'll have 6 feet of the stuff sitting on your head come February." "Maybe," Silas said. "Or maybe the curve will spread the weight so every timber bears its share, instead of putting it all on a few rafters and a ridgepole." Peter Hutchins, who had been silent until now, spoke up. He was young, maybe 20, with the kind of earnest face that still believed problems had clear solutions. "My pa says the ridgepole's the key," he offered. "You get a good thick ridgepole, it'll bear whatever comes." Silas shook his head. "A ridgepole's just one piece of wood. You load it heavy enough, it'll break, same as anything else, but you spread that load across 100 pieces of wood, all working together, and you've got something stronger than any single beam could ever be." McAllister laughed, and it was not a kind sound. "You're overthinking it, Harrow. Men have been building roofs the same way for 1,000 years. You think you're smarter than 1,000 years of builders?" "I think I'm looking at what works," Silas said quietly. "I've seen beaver lodges hold snow loads that would crush any cabin in this valley. I've seen how they build, and I'm learning from it." "You're learning from beavers?" McAllister's voice rose in disbelief. "That's your plan? Build your house like a rodent?" "I'm learning from nature," Silas corrected. "Nature's been at this longer than any carpenter." Garrett shifted his weight, and for a moment Silas thought he saw something in the old man's eyes, something that might have been understanding. But then Garrett shook his head slowly. "It's your cabin, Silas, your risk. But I'll tell you straight, I think you're making a mistake. That roof's going to collect snow, not shed it. And come spring, you're going to be digging yourself out from under a pile of broken timber, if you live that long." They left shortly after that, riding back down the valley, with McAllister still shaking his head and muttering about fools and their folly. Silas watched them go, then climbed back up onto his framework and went back to work. He knew what they thought. He knew what they were saying. And he knew that when the big snows came, they would be watching, waiting to see him proven wrong. But Silas Harrow had made his calculations. He had observed, he had thought, he had planned, and he believed in what he was building. The work went slowly. Each rib had to be secured to the log walls with wooden pegs and iron brackets. Each crossbeam had to be fitted precisely to maintain the curve. And then came the sheathing, layers of split planks that he had to shape and trim to follow the contour of the roof. It was painstaking work, the kind that required patience and precision, but Silas had both. He worked from dawn until dark, and sometimes into the night, by the light of pine torches, and gradually the roof took shape. By mid-December it was finished. The curved roof rose from the walls of the cabin like the shell of some great turtle, smooth and continuous, with no angles, no valleys, no peaks. Silas had covered it with overlapping shakes of split cedar, each one fitted tight against its neighbor, and he had sealed the seams with a mixture of pine pitch and clay. The final touch was a layer of sod on top of the shakes, 6 inches of earth and grass that would provide additional insulation and weight to hold everything in place. It was unorthodox. It was strange. It was, by every conventional measure, wrong. But it was done, and Silas moved his few possessions inside and banked his fire and waited for the winter to show him whether he was a genius or a fool. He didn't have to wait long. The real snows began on December 20th. They came in the night, falling silent and thick, and by morning the world had changed. Everything was white, everything was buried, and the snow was still falling. It fell for 3 days without stopping, and then it paused for a day, and then it started again. By Christmas, the valley was under 4 feet of snow on the level, and the drifts against the north-facing slopes were twice that. Silas kept his fire burning, and his supplies organized, and his mind calm. He had wood enough for the winter, and meat enough, and cornmeal and beans stored in tin-lined boxes that the mice couldn't reach. He was prepared for a siege, and a siege was what he got. The snow kept falling through January, great heavy storms that would blow in from the northwest and dump another foot or two before moving on. The temperature dropped and stayed down, sometimes reaching 30 below zero at night, cold enough that the trees would crack with sounds like rifle shots, cold enough that frost would form on the inside walls of any cabin that wasn't heated properly. Around the valley, the other settlers were struggling. Silas would snowshoe out occasionally when the weather cleared, checking his trapline, visiting neighbors, seeing how they were faring. What he saw troubled him. Garrett's ridgeline had sagged another 6 inches, and the old man had propped it up from inside with a forest of posts and braces, turning his cabin into something that looked more like a mine shaft than a home. The Hutchins family was sleeping with one eye open, listening for the groan of timber that would signal collapse. McAllister had shoveled his roof 3 times already, climbing up with a wooden scoop and pushing the snow off. Dangerous work that had nearly killed him when he slipped and fell, catching himself at the last moment on the eaves. But Silas's roof was fine. More than fine. The gentle curve had done exactly what he had hoped it would do. The snow accumulated, yes, but it accumulated evenly, settling into a thick blanket that covered the entire surface. There were no drifts, no piles, no uneven loading. The weight was distributed across every rib, every crossbeam, every piece of the structure. And more than that, the curve seemed to create its own strength. The deeper the snow got, the more it packed and compressed, and that compression seemed to actually reinforce the curve, pressing down evenly, locking everything together. Silas would climb up occasionally to check, using his snowshoes to scramble up the side and he would walk carefully across the surface, feeling for weak spots, looking for signs of stress. There were none. The roof was solid. The curve held. The cabin was warm inside, protected by that thick layer of snow that acted as insulation, keeping the heat in and the cold out. And still, the snow kept coming. January turned to February, and the storms grew worse. There was a stretch of 10 days where the sun didn't appear once, where the wind howled and the snow fell, and the world contracted to a small circle of firelight and the sound of wind against logs. Silas kept his routine, kept his mind occupied, kept faith in his engineering. He read by firelight, mended his gear, planned for spring, and he listened to the silence of his roof, the absence of groaning timber, the absence of stress. It was on February 14th, a date Silas would remember for the rest of his life, that the final test came. The storm that arrived that day was unlike anything anyone in the valley had ever seen. It came from the north, riding a wind that screamed like something alive, and it brought snow in quantities that seemed impossible. The flakes were small and hard, driven horizontal by the wind, and they came with such density that visibility dropped to zero. You couldn't see your hand at arm's length. You couldn't see the walls of your own cabin from 10 feet away. Silas woke to the sound of that wind, a roar like a waterfall, and he knew immediately that this was different. This was the storm that would separate the strong from the weak, the well-built from the poorly built. He stoked his fire and made coffee and sat at his table, listening. Outside, the world was white chaos. Inside, his cabin was still and warm and solid. The roof made no sound. The storm lasted 48 hours. For 2 full days and nights, the wind howled and the snow fell, and Silas stayed inside, conserving his energy, conserving his resources, trusting his work. He thought about the other settlers, wondered how they were faring, hoped they had sense enough to stay inside and ride it out. There was nothing to be done in weather like this. You could only wait. When the storm finally broke on the morning of February 16th, the silence was shocking. Silas opened his door and looked out at a world transformed. The snow had drifted in fantastic shapes, some sculpted into waves and ridges, others piled into massive heaps against any obstacle. The trees were buried to their first branches. The creek, which had been a thin line of dark water cutting through the white landscape, was now completely covered, invisible, beneath the snow. And everywhere, for as far as he could see, the land was buried under depths that were hard to fathom. Silas strapped on his snowshoes and pushed out from his doorway, breaking trail through snow that came up past his waist, even with the flotation of the shoes. He worked his way around his cabin, checking the structure, looking for damage. The walls were solid, the chinking intact, and the roof was magnificent. It wore its burden of snow like a crown, thick and even, probably 5 feet deep at the center, but showing no sign of distress, no sagging, no stress. The curve held. The engineering held. He made his way down the valley, following the route he knew by memory, since all landmarks were buried. He checked on Garrett first and found the old man sitting outside his cabin in the snow, looking dazed. The roof had held, barely, but just barely. The ridgeline now sagged a full foot, and inside the cabin was a forest of posts and braces, so many that there was barely room to move. Garrett looked at Silas with tired eyes and said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. Next was the Hutchins place. The family was huddled in their wagon, which they had pulled inside the cabin before the storm. The roof had partially collapsed during the night, the north side giving way with a crash that had woken the entire family and sent them scrambling for safety. They had spent the rest of the storm in the wagon, terrified, listening to the wind howl through the new opening in their roof. Mrs. Hutchins was weeping quietly when Silas arrived. Peter looked at him with eyes that held a mix of shame and desperation. "We should have listened," he said simply. McAllister's place was the worst. The big man's roof had failed completely sometime during the second night of the storm. The entire structure had come down, a catastrophic collapse that had filled the cabin with broken timber and snow. McAllister himself had survived only because he had been sleeping in his storm cellar, a dugout beneath the cabin that he had built for storing root vegetables. He had heard the crash above him and stayed put, and in the morning he had dug himself out to find his cabin destroyed. When Silas arrived, McAllister was sitting on what had been his doorstep, staring at the ruins. He looked up as Silas approached, and for a moment his face held that familiar bluster, that certainty that he was right, and everyone else was wrong. But then something changed. His shoulders sagged. His face fell. "I should have listened," he said, echoing young Hutchins. "I should have paid attention to what you were doing instead of assuming I knew better." Silas didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in being right when it meant watching neighbors suffer. Instead, he helped McAllister salvage what could be saved, and then he made his way back up the valley, stopping at each cabin, checking on each family, offering help where he could. Word spread fast in the aftermath of the great storm. People called it the storm of the century, the kind of weather event that happens once in a lifetime, if that. The snow depth at the pass was measured at 22 feet. The temperature had dropped to 42 below zero during the height of the storm. And through it all, only one roof in the entire valley had held, without strain, without stress, without even a creak of protest. Silas Harrow's upside-down roof had proven itself beyond any doubt. By March, when the weather began to moderate and travel became possible again, Silas had visitors almost daily. Men would snowshoe up from miles away to look at his roof, to measure the curve, to ask questions about how it was built. He explained his thinking to anyone who would listen. The observation of the beaver lodges, the calculation of forces, the decision to work with the snow rather than against it. He drew diagrams in the snow with a stick, showing how the curve distributed weight, how it eliminated lateral forces, how it turned a liability into an asset. Some men took notes, some just nodded, and filed the information away. But come spring, when the snow finally melted and the building season began again, Silas noticed something. The new cabins going up in the valley, the rebuilt roofs on structures that had failed, they were different. They weren't exactly like his curved design, but they incorporated elements of it. Lower pitches, stronger cross-bracing, more attention to even load distribution. The vocabulary had changed. Men talked about snow load and compression forces and the strength of curves. They talked about learning from nature, about observation versus assumption. Thomas McAllister rebuilt his cabin that summer, and when he asked Silas for advice on the roof, his voice held no trace of mockery. "I want to do it right this time," he said. "I want to build something that'll last." Silas helped him. He helped all of them. Because that was what you did on the frontier. You shared knowledge. You lifted each other up. You learned from mistakes, and you didn't repeat them. And slowly, over the course of that summer and the summers that followed, the valley changed. The architecture changed. The mindset changed. Years later, long after Silas had grown old in that cabin with the curved roof, visitors would come to the valley and remark on the unusual buildings. "Why are all your roofs built like that?" they would ask. And the locals would tell them the story of the winter of 1843 and the storm that came on February 14th, and the man who had been mocked for his upside-down roof. They would talk about how he had observed rather than assumed, how he had calculated rather than guessed, how he had built something that worked rather than something that looked right. But the story wasn't really about the roof. It was never about the roof. The roof was just wood and nails and shakes, just material shaped to a purpose. The real story was about something deeper, something that separated those who survived on the frontier from those who didn't. It was about the willingness to question conventional wisdom. It was about the humility to learn from sources that others ignored, whether those sources were beaver lodges or native techniques or simple observation of natural phenomena. It was about understanding that the way things have always been done might not be the way things should be done, not if circumstances have changed, not if new challenges require new solutions. Silas Harrow had looked at a beaver lodge and seen not just an animal's home, but a lesson in engineering. He had looked at the conventional steep-pitched roof and seen not timeless wisdom, but a design that was optimized for different conditions, a design that might not be appropriate for the extreme snow loads of a high mountain valley. He had done the thinking that others hadn't bothered to do, the calculating that others had skipped in favor of copying what everyone else was doing. And because he had done that work, because he had been willing to look foolish in order to be correct, he had survived where others had failed. The principle behind that curved roof, that upside-down roof, as the neighbors had called it, was simple once you understood it. Accept the load, distribute it evenly, and let the structure itself do the work. Don't fight forces you can't defeat. Don't try to shed what won't be shed. Instead, work with the reality of the situation, design for the actual conditions you'll face, and build something that gets stronger under pressure rather than weaker. It was a lesson that applied to more than just roofs. It was a lesson about survival itself, about adaptation, about the difference between appearing to know what you're doing and actually knowing what you're doing. The frontier was full of men who appeared confident, who had done things the same way their fathers had done them, who believed that tradition and correctness were the same thing. Most of those men didn't last. They broke under the pressure, or they gave up and went back east, or they died in ways that seemed sudden but were actually the culmination of 1,000 small mistakes, 1,000 instances where they chose appearance over function, tradition over adaptation. But there were others, men and women like Silas Harrow, who looked at the world with clear eyes and open minds, who understood that survival required not just hard work, but smart work, not just courage, but creativity. These were the people who learned from the native tribes that had lived in this land for centuries. These were the people who observed animal behavior and wondered what lessons could be extracted. These were the people who calculated and measured and tested, who weren't afraid to try something new if the old way was failing. And these were the people whose knowledge accumulated, whose techniques were refined and passed down, whose innovations became the foundation for everyone who came after. The curved roof didn't remain unique to Silas Harrow. Within 10 years, variations of it were being built throughout the high valleys of the Rockies, each builder adding his own improvements, each generation refining the technique. The principle spread beyond roofs, influencing how people thought about building in extreme conditions, about engineering structures that could withstand forces that would destroy conventional designs. By the time Silas died, an old man, warm in his cabin on a winter night with snow falling soft outside, the design that had once been mocked as upside down was simply known as good building. Young carpenters didn't build steep-pitched roofs in high snow country anymore. They built curved roofs or low-pitched roofs with massive cross-bracing, or sometimes combinations of techniques that Silas would have recognized as descendants of his original innovation. The knowledge had been absorbed into the collective wisdom of the frontier, no longer attached to one man's name, just part of the way things were done. And that, perhaps, was the greatest measure of success. Not fame, not recognition, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you had figured something out, something important, something that made life a little bit easier, a little bit safer for everyone who came after. You had looked at a problem that was killing people, and you had solved it. You had taken the time to observe, to think, to calculate, to experiment. You had been willing to endure mockery, to be called a fool, to stand alone in your conviction. And you had been proven right, not by argument or rhetoric, but by the simple, undeniable fact of a roof that stood when others fell. The lesson of the upside-down roof echoes across the generations, relevant far beyond that valley, far beyond that winter, far beyond the specific problem of snow load on timber structures. It speaks to a fundamental truth about human adaptation and survival. The solutions to new problems rarely come from blindly applying old methods. They come from observation. They come from questioning assumptions. They come from the willingness to look foolish in the eyes of the crowd in order to be wise in the eyes of nature. Silas Harrow didn't invent the curved roof. Beavers had been using the principle for millennia. Native peoples had built earth lodges with similar properties for centuries, but Silas did something just as important. He paid attention. He saw the connection between natural design and human need. He translated observation into application. He took a principle from one domain and applied it to another. And most critically, he had the courage to trust his own reasoning over the weight of convention. That courage, that willingness to think for oneself, to observe rather than assume, to calculate rather than copy, that is what made the difference between survival and failure on the frontier. It's what still makes the difference in any environment, in any era, when circumstances demand adaptation and old solutions no longer suffice. The tools change, the specific challenges change, but the underlying principle remains constant. Observe closely, think clearly, test thoroughly, and don't be afraid to be called a fool by those who will be proven wrong. The winter of 1843 passed into history. The snow melted, the creeks ran high with meltwater, and the valley burst into life as spring took hold. Silas planted his garden, mended his fences, and went about the work of living. His roof had held. His home had protected him. And the knowledge he had gained, the principle he had proven, rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water, touching lives he would never meet, solving problems he would never see, contributing to the slow accumulation of wisdom that turned a harsh wilderness into a place where families could build homes, raise children, and live out their lives in relative safety and comfort. That was the true legacy of the upside-down roof. Not the structure itself, but the thinking behind it. Not the curved timbers and cedar shakes, but the observation and calculation and courage that had led to their placement. The frontier needed strong backs and willing hands, yes, but it needed something more. Clear eyes and open minds, the ability to see what was actually there rather than what tradition said should be there, and the wisdom to learn from any source that offered a lesson worth learning. Silas Harrow had all of those qualities. He looked at a beaver lodge and saw engineering. He looked at a conventional roof and saw hidden flaws. He looked at mockery and saw opportunity. And when the great storm came, when the snow fell deep enough to crush the unprepared, his home stood strong, a testament not to one man's cleverness, but to the power of observation, the value of calculation, and the reward that comes to those who dare to think differently in a world that demands conformity. The story of that winter, of that roof, of that storm, became legend in the Green River Valley. Parents told it to their children. Builders told it to their apprentices. And always the lesson was the same. Question what everyone knows, observe what everyone ignores, and build not for appearances, but for reality. Do that, and you might just create something that lasts, something that matters, something that changes the way people think about what's possible. That curved roof, that so-called upside-down roof, stood for 73 years before the cabin was finally abandoned, its logs still sound, its structure still solid, long after the man who built it had passed from living memory into legend. And even then, even after the roof itself was gone, the principle remained, woven into the fabric of mountain architecture, a quiet testament to one man's refusal to accept mockery as a substitute for truth, and his willingness to trust observation over assumption, calculation over convention, and reason over ridicule. That is the story of the upside-down roof. But more than that, it's a story about how knowledge survives, how wisdom accumulates, how innovation happens, not in great leaps, but in small observations, careful thinking, and the courage to stand alone when the crowd is wrong. It's a story about the frontier, yes, but it's also a story about the human capacity to adapt, to learn, to improve, to take what nature offers and transform it into tools for survival. And it's a reminder that the next time someone is mocked for doing things differently, for building something that looks wrong, for trusting their own observations over conventional wisdom, they might just be the one who's figured out something important, something that will last long after the laughter fades and the snow falls deep.